Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and to have you here today with us. My name is Carrie Cooper, and I'm Dean of University Libraries at William & Mary. Our alumni are talented, and I am delighted to be able to meet many of our alumni writers and authors. Today, we are talking with Mike Branch, author of How to Cuss in Western. If this is the first book talk you've attended, you are in for a treat. These are a lot of fun, and I just have a feeling, because I've gotten familiar with his writing, that this is going to be super fun. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to ensure that everyone has a good experience today. First, I want to let you know that you can keep your video on if you like. We like to see faces. It's nice to talk to faces. We've muted your microphones for Mike's reading and talk. You may want to change to speaker view for the talk so that you can best see Mike. And lastly, we will have time for Q&A after he's done with his reading. And we hope that you will type your questions into the chat box. If you're not sure how to find that, it's right across the bottom of your screen. You'll see the little chat box. We'll be monitoring that. So anyway, I'd like to pass the floor on to my friend, Tracy Melton. He is a fellow classmate of Mike's, and he's a member of the library's board of directors. So I'll let you take it away from here. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to introduce Mike today. We were in pre-pandemic times. We were students together in DuPont freshman year, and we were roommates junior year in Madison. I can tell everyone that Mike, please don't tell him, but he was a very dynamic, brilliant presence. He's one of the people who I feel like at William & Mary really helped me to broaden my thoughts and to become a better person, which I really appreciate. At William & Mary, he led the student protest to sports cuts, which is a current topic today at William & Mary. He was a diver on the swim team. And he was captain of the ultimate team for 2 years. He went on to UVA and got a PhD. He's been at the University of Nevada in Reno since the early or mid 90s. He's a legendary professor there. He's the professor who every student wants to take his class, even if it's not in their field. He's one of the leaders in the field of environmental literature. He's written numerous books. In recent years, he's written about his family life in the mountains above the Great Basin, north of Nevada. I've had the good fortune to go up to the Ranting Hill, and he's written Rants from the Hill, Raising Wild, and How to Cuss in Western, which are great books on parenting, and really brilliant short stories. I love Beauregard Dog and The Hills Are Alive, about reenacting the sound of music with his young daughters up in the mountains, and Big Dan the Bee Man, all brilliant stories. So that's enough from me. Here's Michael Branch.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you. And Tracy said we were roommates on our freshman hall, and as I look out at these Hollywood squares of Zoom images that are moving around, I see 2 or 3 guys from our freshman hall. So we're still friends. We still hang out, get together almost every year, and have so many great memories of being there. I want to thank John Hunter and Tammy Back and Tim Von Stetten for helping to put this together, and especially Carrie Cooper for inviting me to be with you guys. I work with the university libraries a lot here in Nevada, and I really want to thank all of you and encourage you to continue supporting your libraries, and also during this really difficult time, your independent bookstores as well. And thanks to Tracy, we've been friends a long time. Yeah, he mentioned that we lived together junior year. This is how long ago it was. I was a writer then too, and we wrote on typewriters, which some of you may be familiar with. And Tracy and I had bunk beds in our dorm room, and he had the top bunk, I had the bottom, and my writing desk was against his bunk. And I would write all night long. And Tracy, as he slept, would always flop his arm over onto my writing desk. And because I had an actual conventional typewriter, every time the carriage got all the way to the left, I'd have to lift his arm up, return the carriage, and then set his arm back down again. So those were the days. It was a long time ago. For those of you who don't know, Tracy is an awesome historian and writer himself, and he's been writing some really great stuff lately about Williamsburg and William & Mary, and you can get at that stuff on the William & Mary blog, which is on the library's homepage. I would definitely encourage you to check it out. So real quick, before I share a couple of pieces with you, I thought I'd kind of make a couple comments about my work in recent years to give you a little bit of a sense of context. I spent a lot of my career as a literary scholar writing about other people's stuff. And in recent years, I've turned to writing my own books, mostly creative nonfiction and humor work, still really deeply interested in relationships between human culture and place. So basically environmental writing. And there are kind of three main influences on these last 3 or 4 books. The first is that I write about my home place. I grew up in Virginia and I miss it terribly, but my home place is the Great Basin Desert. I live in northwestern Nevada. If you're not familiar, the Great Basin Desert is a high elevation, cold desert. It's gigantic. It's the largest desert in North America. At 110,000 square miles, it's about 3 times the size of Virginia, just this desert alone. And it's a really misunderstood landscape because it doesn't look like our conventional idea of beautiful nature, right? It doesn't look like a Sierra Club calendar. It doesn't look like a romantic painting. So to our environmental aesthetic, a lot of times it seems really barren. And so part of my writing is to represent this landscape and get people to rethink what their idea of beauty is, to maybe reconsider that desert landscapes can be meaningful in other ways. And, you know, landscapes are like people. When we perceive any of them as less important or less valuable, then those landscapes, just like those people, are going to get mistreated. So just as an example, it's no accident that Nevada is the proposed location for the nation's high-level radioactive waste to be stored. If you see a landscape as a wasteland, you're going to treat it as a wasteland. And so my writing is trying to sort of push back against that. And just to remind you guys, if you haven't been out west lately, most of the Intermountain West is your land. It's public land. About 2 billion acres of America consists of public lands. That turns out to be about 7 acres for every man, woman, and child in the country. So all of y'all have a stake in what goes on in our Western land management. And I hope you'll kind of keep that in mind too, even from the beautiful Old Dominion, that this is your country out here too. The backdrop that I have up is just what this place looks like. I just shot this with my camera a week or so ago when I was taking my little kid to do some outdoor rock climbing. So that gives you a little bit of sense of what it looks like all the time around here. It's a hard landscape to describe, so I thought that image might be helpful. And then Tracy mentioned that I write about my family a lot. In American environmental literature, we have this kind of genre or subgenre called the retreat narrative, and you're all familiar with it. It basically consists of men alone going into nature to have some kind of redemptive experience, right? So, you know, Henry Thoreau going to Walden Pond, or at the beginning of Melville's Moby Dick, Ishmael saying, "I'm sick of people, I'm heading out to sea," or Mark Twain's Huck Finn, you know, getting on that raft on the Mississippi or lighting out for the Western Territory. It's deep in our culture, this idea that men alone move from women, relationships, families, jobs, adult responsibility, and go into this, you know, beautiful freedom of nature. And that narrative has always really bothered me, because I think if I asked all of you guys, what's the most important thing in your life, probably most of you would say your family. So why have we developed this kind of writing that celebrates, you know, dudes alone going away from their families? So these last 3 books, I've really been experimenting with the idea of what if I write a retreat narrative, but rather than being a man retreating to the wilderness from his family, I retreat with my family. So for 15 years, my wife and 2 daughters and I lived in this very remote area of the Great Basin Desert. And so the books kind of explore this braiding of culture and place, what it was like to be a father, and especially a father to daughters, since American wilderness has often been figured as a masculine space. You know, what's it like to raise girls out there? I, for more than 15 years, have had this ritual of trying to walk 1,000 miles a year on the public lands adjacent to my house. So I've walked like 25,000 miles right in the desert where I live. And these books are also kind of a meditation on what it's like to get to know a landscape really deeply through repeated exposure. And then the third thing that's kind of been pushing on the way I write in recent years is humor. I'm really trying to work with humor as a new kind of way of talking about environmental issues, because, you know, environmental writing in our country for a long time has been dominated by 2 sort of rhetorical modes, anger and sadness, right? So you think of the Jeremiad, goes all the way back to Puritan preachers saying, you know, you backslidden sinners, you're the ones who's causing the world to go to hell. You got to change your ways. So we have the Jeremiad on the one hand, the kind of angry tirade that tells us we're doing everything wrong. And then the elegy, which is a very stylized literary form that kind of allows us to express grief and loss, which is important. I mean, we're living in an age of massive biodiversity loss and extinction. And, we need a way to measure that emotionally and psychologically. But as a writer, I really got thinking about what my responsibilities to my readers are, because as a reader, I was starting to find I'm getting sick of picking up these environmental books and just being exposed to people who are angry and sad all the time. I mean, I guess I would say if you're not angry and sad about what's going on with the environment these days, you're probably not paying attention. But on the other hand, I think we would all agree that none of us wants to be angry and sad all the time. So I've been experimenting with humor as a new way into some of these environmental conversations. People suffer. It's a hard time right now, and we all go through hard times in our lives. And I think humor can be a really regenerative force that allows us to talk about some hard things and do it in a way that, doesn't always bum us out. So I'm really optimistic about the potential for humor as a way of addressing lots of stuff, including environmental issues. I think the jury is out on it. We'll see how it works out, but I'm hopeful anyway. So that's a little bit of background to help you kind of understand where I'm coming from. And I might have chosen readings from any of these recent books, but as it turns out, I'm going to read two really short pieces from my book, Rants from the Hill, which Tracy mentioned. And Ranting Hill was our nickname for the hill on which we lived way out in the desert for those 15 years. And so I'm going to share a couple of stories from there. And then I'm really looking forward to Q&A. So you can ask me about technique, or we can just talk about larger issues, whatever suits you. So let me get started and share a little of the work with you. Okay, so this first piece is about a 10-minute read. The second one's even shorter, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk. So this one, again, from my book, Rants from the Hill, is called My Home Lake. And I'm a fan of starting essays one way and then making a hard pivot. Editors hate this, by the way, so I'm in constant negotiations. But you'll see this move in both of the pieces that I'm going to read to you today. So, My Home Lake. Edward Abbey began his book, Desert Solitaire, with these words: "This is the most beautiful place on earth. There are many such places. My home here in Silver Hills, Nevada, is the most gorgeous place on the planet in just the way Cactus Ed intended. It's nestled in a gently sloping basin surrounded by granitic hills that are dotted with bitterbrush and big sage. In the spring, balsam root and lupin cover the upland slopes in a drapery of bright yellow and purple, while the pink flush of desert peach ignites the rocky draws. In autumn, golden domes of rabbit brush appear everywhere. Green fingers of ephedra, which emerge from a blanket of snow in winter, are grazed by pronghorn and mule deer. My home lake is also a jewel on the necklace of the Pacific Inland Flyway and is home to at least 80 species of birds. All year round, we see golden eagles here and harriers, red-tails, kestrels, and ravens, great horned owls, western kingbirds, mountain bluebirds, horned larks. So perfectly lovely is this place that when it came time to marry, I decided to hike Aaron to the top of the nearby hills. There, on a crisp fall day, just like this one, we rested on granite boulders, gazed out across the stunning expanse of the lake, and decided to spend our lives together. In this place, as in no other, there is a stark clarity of light, a rippling play of shadow, a catharsis of wind that makes you want to begin your life anew. There's one more thing I should mention about my home lake. It has no water. Now, I realize that some people are so shamefully effete that they might expect a lake to have water. Some folks may even think they deserve to have water in a lake, that they're spoiled enough to feel entitled to it. It wouldn't even surprise me if there are people who would argue that a big empty basin of land without a drop of water shouldn't even be called a lake. I suspect these are the same folks who drive across the desert without so much as slowing down and report back that there is nothing there. Well, that same nothing fills my home lake. And those of us who live here don't see our lake as being empty of water. We see it as being full of light and wind, full of coyotes and rattlers, full of the kind of space that only the high desert can hold, space that's crowded out of other landscapes by irritating obstructions like trees and water. even if there are no trees blocking your view. How can you really see a lake if the damn thing is all filled up with water? Although my home lake is what's called a dry lake or alkali flat, such lakes exist around the globe and are graced with a variety of lyrical names. Kavir in Iran, Takir in Central Asia, Abka in much of the Arabic world, Pan in South Africa, and Salar in most of South America. The term most widely used in Mexico and in the Intermountain West is playa lake. To scientists, this is an endorheic lake, which is just a hydro-wonky way of saying that it exists in a closed basin in which water flows in but never flows out. Moisture arriving here by any means will either evaporate or be absorbed into the ground. In this kind of internal drainage system, the concept of downstream simply does not apply. This special place is where water comes to die and to be reborn. An endorheic lake such as this one has a dry bed. Around here we call the lake bed a playa, which is Spanish for beach, which is among the flattest landscapes on Earth. This is why desert playas are used for rocketry and for setting land speed records. It's also why huge playas like Smoke Creek and Black Rock are the site of what I like to call Nevada's signature form of outdoor recreation. First, drive your truck out onto the playa. Then, weight the accelerator pedal with a chunk of granite or jimmy it with a bitterbrush branch. As the vehicle begins covering ground, tune the radio to the baseball game, then clamber out your window and onto the top of your truck's cab. Be sure to take the six-pack with you. Now, sit back and enjoy the sun, the breeze, and the scenery of the distant mountains as your unmanned truck drives itself randomly across the expansive sublimity of the most isotropic landscape on planet Earth. And if you guys don't believe me, I made a book trailer where I actually do this. So you can just Google how to cuss in Western book trailer, and you'll see me actually do this gag at 45 miles an hour where I climb out my window and onto the roof of my truck. Wear your shades because playas are bright white from a coating of fine-grained saline sediment that contains evaporative minerals such as borax and sodium carbonate. The playa is also the cradle of fantastic dust storms as rising spirals of hot wind whip the white dust into towering gyres that can be seen for miles. Recent research even shows that the particles liberated from playas in this way act as condensation nuclei. They are the seeds from which clouds are grown in the wild garden of the sky. My grandpa, who I'm proud to say was a home brewer during Prohibition, used to tell me stories of accidentally over-sugaring his beer batches and having the bottles explode beneath the beds where they were hidden. A lot of people wet their beds back then, he used to say, from the bottom up. Playa lakes are often created in the same way. They're flooded from below. Even in the absence of runoff from snowmelt, it sometimes happens that the water table beneath the playa rises high enough to intersect the surface, at which point water percolates up onto the endorheic lake bed from below. When that happens, what looks like the sun-baked, rock-hard surface of the playa is actually a thin crust, beneath which looms a subterranean megalake. Every now and then, some uninitiated visitor tearing across the playa at high speed fails to notice the telltale dimples that subtly reveal the upward movement of underground water. No matter, they figure it out when the crust of the playa cracks like thin ice and their vehicle is swallowed by the water below. Like many larger endorheic terminus lakes, my little home lake does have water in it now and then. Even in dry years, there's enough subsurface moisture around its margin to sustain tules, the reeds traditionally used by our northern Paiute neighbors, to fashion everything from delicate duck decoys to functional boats to thatching for their sturdy wickiups. Coyote willow, which also grows around the lake, is handy on hard hikes. Break off a branch and chew on it a little as you walk. And its natural salicin, which is chemically related to aspirin, has a mild analgesic effect. If we've had a big snow year, The runoff onto the playa during the meltout will create a broad expanse of gleaming water, though the lake may be no more than a few inches deep. In those years, it becomes an oasis for wading birds, including stilts, avocets, and ibis. If we've had several wet winters in a row, the lake becomes more expansive and a bit deeper. And in those years, migrating tundra swans will join the resident Canada geese in wintering with us. In one unusually wet year, we had more than 100 graceful swans on the lake from Thanksgiving until we uncorked the Redbreast Irish whiskey on St. Paddy's Day. That was the winter we almost forgot that water is not a permanent feature of this landscape. Here in the desert, even a lake is like a swan, an antelope, a wildfire, a moment of clarity. It comes and goes. In most parts of most years, my home lake is bone dry, and sometimes it remains parched for so long that it becomes a vast, lovely garden of weeds. It's been perfectly waterless for 3 years now, just as it was on that shimmering day 20 years ago, when I looked out over this light-filled basin and asked Erin to set aside her usual good sense and marry me. On such a day, who needs water? Besides, I'm so accustomed to hiking through the lake that I'm not sure I'd want to go around it. And Outside Magazine did a piece on my writing, and there's a great picture of me with my little daughters walking through this dry lake bed. A lake without water speaks more to memory and to hope than it does to the kind of certainty that is so rare on this side of the Vale of Tears. Most of what we love is ultimately transient, and it takes a desiccated resilience to reconcile with that fact. So the term I like best to describe the intermittent, uncertain nature of this Ender-Hyatt Great Basin Playa Lake is ephemeral. If the ephemerality of my home lake makes it less picturesque, its periodic waterlessness also gives it a hard, bright certainty that inspires appreciation for what it means to live in this world. The water will return in time. Until it does, we will gaze out across this shimmering lake bed and slake our thirst with light. So thanks for hanging with me. And that's an example of sort of using this technique of some personal narrative, some humor to try to trick you into learning a little something about the desert, sort of try to express my love for the landscape without being too polemical, too preachy about it. So that was fun to read. Just had my wedding anniversary recently. I always think of that piece on my anniversary. So most of my stuff involves trying to sort of entice people into thinking about some environmental issues that they may or may not want to think about. But occasionally, I try to use human characters to define this weird, cool place where we live in the desert, and to look at kind of the intersection between the physical environment and the cultural, like, you know, what is the landscape like, but also what are the people like? And as you can imagine, in the wilderness of rural Nevada, out in the desert, the people are pretty unusual. And so I tell stories about them as well. So I thought I would just end here with something a good bit lighter. It doesn't have much of an argument, but it'll give you some sense of how crazy this place is where we live. And this piece reads in about 8.5 minutes, and you'll see, again, like the last one, it starts with one approach and then makes a hard lateral cut. This is called A Visit from the Mary Kay Lady. It's unfortunate that we English speakers have relatively few words for mud, a substance that varies so greatly by location and conditions that it would be handier to have 100 terms for it, as the indigenous Nordic Sami people do for snow. If a useless neologism, which is a fancy word for a made-up word, I'm kind of poking fun at it, if a useless neologism like ginormous can make the Oxford English Dictionary, you'd think we could spare an extra word or two to distinguish one person's home mud from another's. Out here in Silver Hills, our mud is less a description of the ground than it is a full season, a marker of identity, a way of life. lacking 100 helpful synonyms for mud. I think instead of stories that suggest what's special about the thick, deep, slippery gunk that we Silver Hillbillies call gumbo. When hiking during mud season in spring, the gumbo becomes so heavy on our boots that we often find it easier to shuffle along like cross-country skiers than to lift our heavy feet off the ground. When driving on even the slightest slope, it makes little difference whether you put your foot on the gas or brake, since even while braking, you simply slide along without resistance, like a capsule gliding through space. Our gumbo also has the unique quality of sticking to itself, gathering so thickly on truck tires that it's limited only by the wheel wells, which shear it off with each revolution, neat as a spindle turning on a lathe. In early spring, the road to our house is sometimes so thick with gumbo that it becomes impassable even to high clearance four-wheel drive vehicles. When that happens, we have two choices: either park at the paved road and slog several miles in through the muck, or wait in town until evening when the mud freezes up, making it viscous enough that it becomes possible to pilot perilously across it. In more than a decade out here, I've never completed a full mud season without sliding off the road, and our family now runs the gumbo pool. $5 buys you a guess as to the first date on which one of us, neighbors included, will end up in the ditch. But the best thing about mud season in Silver Hills is the gumbo luge, which my little daughters Hannah and Caroline absolutely love. Here's how it works. When the spring thaw begins, the first dozen truck trips down our road leave shallow wheel ruts. Those ruts deepen a little each day, and by mid-season are so deep that it's risky to avoid them, since a slide into the ruts results in a jaw-rattling drop that's hard on spines as well as transmissions. Instead, the trick is to get squarely into these twin tire canyons from the start, after which the impressive depth of the channels unfailingly prevents your vehicle from sliding off the road. In fact, the ruts are so deep that you can drive our road without ever placing your hands on the steering wheel. Instead, you simply slide along, secure in the deep tracks that guide your rig even around hairpin turns. No true Silver Hillbilly would ever be caught with their hands on the wheel while running the gumbo luge. And in fact, it's common practice to lace your fingers behind your head while gunning your truck along through the muddy slots. One morning, during the height of mud season, I was sitting at my writing desk looking out the window, which is about all I ever do at my writing desk, when I saw a spectacle so astonishing and surreal that I grabbed my birding binoculars to scope it out. There in the twin tubes of the binocs was a pink Cadillac fishtailing wildly up our driveway. Now understand that in all my years on Ranting Hill, I had never seen a two-wheel drive vehicle out here during mud season, that our driveway is an unbroken half-mile long sheet of hazardous gumbo, and that the only pink things I've ever seen around here are rock penstemon, long-leafed phlox, and my kids' pacifiers. I instantly sprinted for the door, booted up, and headed out to see what would become of whomever was crazy enough to brave Silver Hills gumbo in a caddy. From the crest of the knoll beneath Ranting Hill, I witnessed an utterly indelible image. The pink Cadillac had gone sideways off the driveway, slid down a small hill, and lodged firmly atop a charred juniper stump, where it rested with its rear end up in the air and its wheels spinning madly, shotgunning mud everywhere. Covering my face with my forearm to deflect the gumbo strafing, I worked my way down to the car, which had music blaring from behind its tinted windows. I rapped on the driver's side window and waited for a reply. Eventually, the power window rolled slowly down and Loretta Lynn came blasting out. Well, slow gin fizz works mighty fast if you drink it by the pitcher and not by the glass. In the driver's seat was a middle-aged woman who looked uncannily like Loretta, only frosted blonde. She held in her hand a highball glass from which she had apparently managed to spill not one drop of her cocktail. Rather than turning the music down, she held her pointer finger up as if to say, hold on a second, then took a sip of her drink and gunned the engine again. Your tires aren't on the ground, I shouted over the cranking tunes, revving engine and splattering mud. What's that, hun? She yelled back. Your tires, I screamed, pointing helpfully toward the part of her car that was 3 feet off the ground. She took another sip of her cocktail, leaned slowly out the window, craned her neck backward, and then began to laugh, reaching out to give me a fist bump, as if she'd just slapped in the game-winning RBI. She then turned off the ignition and, in the silence that followed, said in a gravelly voice, I'm the Mary Kay lady. Want a drink? If she looked like Loretta Lynn, she sounded more like Tom Waits. Though it was 11 in the morning, I felt obliged not to let her drink alone, and so I promptly agreed. She spread her knees, reached down between her ankles, and pulled a thermos and a second highball glass from beneath the driver's seat, pouring me a tall one of something that tasted suspiciously like straight gin. I came to invite you to a party, she said, but I forgot the invitation. I don't want to get my heels muddy, she continued, pulling out her phone, so let's just have a drink. She made a quick call, described roughly where she was, and instructed someone on the other end of the line to bring blush. We passed the next half hour pleasantly, she turning the Loretta back on and passing fresh drinks through the window, me standing up to my ankles in gumbo and receiving what I'm guessing were excellent tips about skincare. Just as we polished off the thermos, a large man wearing a huge hat came riding up our driveway on a ginormous horse. He dismounted with a wide smile, climbed down the hill, shook my hand firmly, and then lifted the Mary Kay lady out through the window of the caddy, drink still in hand, gently folding her over his broad shoulder like a sack of grain. Clambering up the slope, he placed her on the horse, whose name, it turned out, was Blush. He then slid the pointed toe of his boot into the stirrup and swung himself up behind her, encircling her waist with his arms, as the two of them rode off together, laughing. I could see her clear plastic heels tapping Blush's flanks as the big man hollered back at me, "Thanks, Chief, see you after mud season." It took a few weeks for the gumbo to firm up enough for a tow truck to get in and winch out the abandoned car, during which time I had the great pleasure of sitting at my writing desk, looking down at that beautiful pink wreck stranded among the gooseberry brush. To commemorate the visit from the Mary Kay lady, whose name I never learned, I did what I think any eccentric reclusive writer would have done. I composed a haiku. Light pink Cadillac, high centered on an old stump, wheels spinning freely. That, my friends, is an absolutely true story, by the way. So thank you very much for inviting me and for bringing me back to William & Mary, where I haven't been in a long time, even if it's virtually and not in the flesh. I'll look forward to being with you some other time. So thanks for bearing with me. And again, those last 3 books are Raising Wild, Rants from the Hill, and How to Cuss in Western is the most recent one. Carrie's holding it up for you. So I'll turn it back over to whoever's going to run this show, and I'll be very happy to take comments or questions from y'all, and we can just kind of have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. My very best friend works for Mary Kay Corporation. I can't wait to familiarize her with that story. She doesn't sell the product, but she does work for the company. So, but I'm going to open it now for questions, and so you can ask yourself, or you can put it in the chat box. If you put it in the chat box, I'll read it out to Mike to get his response. Stuart?
Stuart, you're muted.
There you go.
Okay, there. It said the host wasn't allowing me to do that. So shame on you. So loved every minute of the book. Particularly, I loved the piece about circumnavigating the mountain and the sacredness of mountains. And I'm going to send it to one of my former English students who has been journaling now for 50 some years, I think. And he goes around Mount Rainier several times a year by himself. He'll love it. But do I gather from your conversation that you have left Ranting Hill?
Yes, after 15 years on the Hill, we moved to town not too long ago, and we're going to spend a few years here. We moved on to the same street where my parents live, and so part of the purpose of that move is to be closer to them, help them out. Also, my girls are teenagers now, and so so that helps as well. But I do hope to get back. I still walk over 1,000 miles a year in the desert. I'm still really close to public land, even though I'm here in town. So in some ways, my lifestyle hasn't changed that much, but I do hope to move back to the rurals as soon as possible. But for this window, I felt like both my parents and my kids needed me to be here, and it was a very hard move for me. Thank you for asking, and I appreciate your comment too about the fancy term is ritual circumambulation. But all over the world, there are cultures who practice the religious ritual of walking around sacred sites, including mountains, as a way of sort of paying homage to them. And actually I have a piece coming out in a couple weeks in National Parks Magazine. If you want to look that up, it'll be out soon. And it's about the ritual circumambulation of Mount Tamalpais near San Francisco, which has been happening 4 times a year for about 60 years. And there's a great literary tradition that goes with that. So, I go and do that hike, and I interview people who do it and try to understand how this cultural tradition of people walking around mountains, where that comes from, and what that kind of ritual or practice does for people in their relationship to place. So, and thank you so much for your kind words about the book. And I hear that, also Carrie mentioned this, I hear that Mary Kay ladies are not always enamored of that story, but I have yet to know for sure. But thank you for your kind words about the book. And yeah, we're not on the Hill, but I still hike that desert every day.
Oh, great.
So
Somebody else, I'm happy also just to have impressions or comments. Don't feel like you have to craft a question if you just want to join the conversation.
Well, I will say that your love of that place just makes me love that place, and I'm not familiar with it. So it's just so special to have, your writing is just so clear and so beautiful. And I just can't wait to run out and get the others. So obviously this is your contribution to the world, is just making everybody think very clearly about the environment and our impact on it. I really am enjoying it.
No, that's a kind comment. And I see out in these boxes a couple of friends who I know are teachers, and I'm sure they tell you the same thing, that as a teacher, one of the oldest tricks in the book is, if you're really excited about something, then eventually your students will, even if they don't expect to be excited about that book or that film or that concept, they just sort of get intrigued with why you're so passionate about it, and that can be their doorway in. So I hope it is working, that my appreciation for this landscape, I hope will be a little bit contagious, at least pique people's curiosity, at least make them kind of think twice about their own environmental aesthetics, because we make lots of judgments every day about what we think is beautiful and what we think is ugly without really stopping to ask, where did those criteria come from? How have I been influenced by all kinds of cultural factors? And then also to think again about, if we have some landscapes that we're willing to dismiss as wasteland, what are the implications of that kind of assumption? So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
I think we have a question from Lindsay Blunt.
Hi, I work at William & Mary at Swim Library, and I actually worked at the Walden Woods Project for 4 years.
Cool.
Jeff Kramer says that he wishes he could be here.
Thank
But
you.
I am a huge Henry David Thoreau fan. You might see this whole section of my bookcase is Thoreau. and some other transcendentalists. But so I wanted to say thank you for putting Henry in back in a book in modern day. It's amazing to see his name. I love that you also don't enjoy his poetry and you likened it to the side of a milk carton, because I totally agree with that surmise of Henry or Thoreau's poetry. I'm struck when I was reading this that it does sort of flow like Walden a little bit, or some of his other essays. So very clearly, oh, I don't know if I froze. Very clearly, Thoreau has made an impression on you, and I'm just wondering, because sometimes you're a little critical on him too. So I'm wondering, maybe what is your relationship with Thoreau as you've sort of gone on this journey that is a little Thoreauvian, and also maybe you didn't go there to write the book, like Thoreau didn't go to Walden to write Walden, right? He went there to mourn, but you ended up writing a book about your experience. So maybe could you just speak on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks for your work with the Walden Woods Project. That's terrific stuff. Yeah, I have been profoundly influenced by Thoreau, but you know, this is the nature of influence, right? It has two sides. One side is to be inspired by a model or a hero. The other side is to immediately feel the burden of that legacy on you, right? So I feel this way, and I know other environmental writers feel this way. One of my friends who's an environmental writer jokes that you know, he's the Thoreau of East Dennis, Massachusetts, because there's this sort of rhetorical convention that if you're a nature writer and you celebrate a local place, you become the Thoreau of whatever that place is, right? So, you know, I'm the Thoreau of the Western Great Basin Desert, I guess. But I really admire Thoreau. But one big difference between my work and his is that he's so intentionally combative. He really wants to get in your face and force you to question your values. And that's part of what I really appreciate about his work. It's one of the things that has shaped my own thinking. As a writer, you know, I sort of prefer the carrot to the stick. I want people to enjoy themselves, feel safe in a way, feel like we're laughing together rather than they're being laughed at. But no, I admire Thoreau deeply. I teach Thoreau all the time. I can't think of a writer who's influenced me more. And in fact, when I first went into graduate school, it was to study 19th century American lit. Before I became a creative writer and a humor writer, you know, I basically did stuff like Thoreau all the time. You know, one of my girls, her middle name is Virginia, which tells you how much I miss that place. And the other one's middle name is Emerson. So, you know, I really have been profoundly influenced by the Transcendentalists. And, you know, Thoreau actually, speaking of humor, you know, I think is quite funny, but most people don't really see that. And you had mentioned, Lindsay, what a lot of people are not aware of, which is that he went to Walden Pond to mourn the death of his brother. Thoreau only published 2 books in his lifetime, and they were, you know, one was an utter financial failure. The other was, Walden was, you know, okay, but not a success for sure. But, you know, one of the bravest moments in American literature was, you know, back in the day when you published a book, if all the copies of that book didn't sell, the publisher would literally ship all the extra copies back to you physically. So, you know, Thoreau had published his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, in 1849, and the book was an utter financial failure, and it was an elegy to his dead brother, John. So, you know, he had poured his whole soul into this book, and then people basically said, this is a lousy book. So the publisher sent sent from Boston by cart all the unsold copies of that book back to Thoreau in Concord. And he wrote in his journal, not for anybody's consumption, but in his private journal that night, he wrote, "I am the proud owner of a library of over 900 volumes, half of which I wrote myself," because that was how many extra copies had been shipped back to him. So I not only take Thoreau as a model in terms of attention to place and an ability to dwell deeply, to create a deep map of a location, just like my ritual of walking 1,000 miles a year in more or less the same place. That's what Thoreau did his whole life in the Walden Woods, but also the courage he showed as a writer. He was not a successful writer by the standards of his day. And yet, you know, today, I think many of us would say that he really changed our lives. So thank you for your work. And so, yeah, when I rag on him, that's my way of just trying to get a little daylight, I think. So thank you, Lindsay.
Ward, you're up now.
Okay, yeah, I just want to say I'm another member of that freshman hall. that Mike and Tracy and a few others lived on. And a couple of us have been messaging back and forth privately about the sort of odds that we would have gotten, you know, I won't say how many years ago that we would be enjoying this. And then we sort of realized that, you know, being entertained by hearing you read something actually would have been pretty predictable. The respectable air that kind of went with it would have been entirely out of any realm of possibility. I just wanted to say a couple of, I mean, I've read Mike's, well, first of all, put in a plug for you of a sort. I mean, I've read several of these books, and I'm a huge fan of the hard pivot that you're talking about. You know, editors be damned, right? I mean, it's you get to that point when you read enough of Mike's stories that you start really looking forward to that hard pivot, wondering what direction he's going to take things. Another thing I want to say about his stories is that the you know, people who write about the natural world and bring in larger issues are, you know, invariably writing in metaphors. Mike's metaphors are as seamless and graceful as any you're likely to find in this type of writing, because it's hard to avoid kind of clunky, hit you over the head metaphors when it comes to drawing lessons from nature. And I never sort of felt that way about those kinds of revelations in your stories. But one of the things that I enjoy the most, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, is the way that you challenge categories, right? I mean, you saw that in the art, the story about your home lake, right? And so, who decides what is a lake? Why does a lake have to have water in it? You described a garden of weeds as vast and beautiful, but I mean, people don't think of weeds as beautiful, right? And that's something that in a lot of your stories you see. I mean, trying to kind of subvert and turn on their head typical definitions of what's beautiful. Who's an insider, who's an outsider is one that I see in a lot of your stories too. So is that something that is that toward the top of the priorities that you sort of set yourself when you write these stories, trying to kind of confound people's sense of what counts as what and what sort of categories they place stuff in?
And that's great, Warden. It's good to see you. First of all, I should say, I feel like Mark Twain, who used to pay people to sit in the audiences at his gigs, and he would tell them when to laugh, and it would make other people feel like they had to laugh. So I'm looking out at all these squares and seeing guys from my freshman hall and just feeling like if every gig I did could be seated with these guys like Tracy and Ward and Al, this would be a better world for me. So maybe you guys, now that all my gigs are Zoom gigs, maybe all of you should just be at everything I do. That might work better. So anyway, it's good to see you all. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of where that comes from, Ward, is just people look at the Great Basin Desert and they, you know, the list of adjectives is all pejorative, right? It's barren, it's ugly, it's wasteland, there's nothing there. And so you have to start with the fundamental challenge of, you know, how do I get people to re-examine that set of assumptions? The specific technique that you're talking about of kind of trying to redefine things, you know, to come back to the earlier question, you know, that is right out of Thoreau's playbook, that inversion, that rhetorical inversion. You know, one of my favorite lines from Walden is, you know, a man is wealthy according to the number of things that he can afford to let alone. In other words, he redefines wealth as independence and simplicity. So he's always like taking your dominant concepts about what matters and tries to get you to turn them inside out a little bit. So, you know, I have to do that out here. And another reason I have to do it is that, you know, the rurals in the Intermountain West are not only very politically conservative, as you know, but also this is ranching and mining country. This is not a place where environmentalists are welcome. So I had to figure out, okay, I love the land and my neighbors who are ranchers and miners love the land, but I can't use a word like wilderness because out here, capital W wilderness is a legal designation. It's exactly what my neighbors don't ever want to see happen out here. They see that as removing public lands from their use. Environmentalists are, you know, lefty hippies who can't be worked with. So, you know, I had to reinvent a vocabulary for attachment to place that would allow me to reach across and communicate with other people who didn't share my vocabulary. So, you know, I had to retrain myself in some ways not to sound too much like an environmentalist. So yeah, and that's one reason I really like that hard pivot you describe. And Ward and I are joking, editors hate this because they feel like it confuses people, right? Like, you know, the first paragraph of everything should tell everybody what the whole thing is about. And I just believe that writing is all about surprise. And as a reader, if I'm not surprised, I don't feel energized. So, you know, I always want, and in fact, in some ways, the first piece I read, as much as I am invested in that lyrical writing about how beautiful the landscape is that I open that piece with, in a way, I'm kind of reeling you in like, hey, this sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't this sound like every nature book you've ever read? And then a really surprising turn that makes you ask new kinds of questions. So I don't know, part of it is motivated, I guess, by just me becoming bored with, and I hate to say it, you know, but I was becoming bored with environmental writing, which is a genre I've dedicated my whole life to. And so challenging some of those formulae by including some of this oppositional or lateral work, I think has really been helpful. And you know, it's cool to be a closeted environmentalist. Like, you know, I'm a hardcore environmentalist, and yet out here, everybody thinks of me as he's a Nevada writer. He's our guy. He understands us. You know, people in the rurals who don't identify with, you know, literary stuff at all. Like I'm their guy because I understand rural Nevada. And so that's kind of cool to be able to address a range of different audiences and not assume that you have to share my politics in order to share the experience of what I'm writing. Great question, Ward. Now I see why you got all those degrees.
Marjorie wants to know the name of the town that you're living in. And I'll ask, is there anything about living in the town that has surprised you?
Well, first of all, let me say that I referred a bunch of times to Silver Hills, Nevada, where I lived when I was on Ranting Hill. Silver Hills, Nevada does not exist. And I write creative nonfiction. I tell the truth, but I do not want my books to attract a zillion people to this specific place. So I invented a name. And we can talk about the ethics of that move. That's not something everybody would agree with. But the reason I did that was, you know, I have learned a lot from Edward Abbey's work, a Western environmental writer, activist, and humorist. When he wrote his books about places like Moab, Utah, nobody had heard of those places. And you go to Moab today, you know, good luck getting a hotel room. I don't mean that people shouldn't go out and explore these landscapes, but I just wasn't prepared to be responsible to my home landscape and to my rural neighbors for turning that landscape into a kind of celebrity. I mean, the solitude of it is what's most beautiful. I walked over 15,000 miles and saw 3 recreational hikers in that time. So that gives you a sense of the solitude of it. So, but now I teach at the University of Nevada, Reno. So I've moved into Reno and I live on the outskirts of town, and I'm 2 blocks from public lands that go all the way into the Carson Range of the Sierra, including designated wilderness, which is that land that a lot of my rural neighbors would not like to see us have. So from my door in 45 minutes, you know, I can be in designated wilderness. I can launch a 2-week backpacking trip from my suburban home. So one of the things that's really special about this town, and I would like to see other towns work toward this around the country, is not just that there's wilderness out there somewhere, but that we have proximity to it that makes it usable for us. I think that's really, really important because people fight for what they love what they know, and they know what they experience. So yeah, okay, Alaska, you know, it sounds beautiful. How many of us are going to get to hang out there? But if we can manage our public lands in a way that allow us to have wilderness near population centers, I think more and more people will not only benefit from an exposure to those landscapes, but they'll be more likely to value them and ultimately to fight for them. That's why whenever I'm doing a gig outside the West, as I did today, I try to remind people, you know, those billions of acres of public lands, that's a public trust. That's not for Westerners, that's for all of us. And people everywhere need to care about how those lands are managed. So that was a long answer to a simple question. The answer is I live in Reno, but I'm still on the land every day.
Great. I'm looking at some of the chat box.
I see the note about Pyramid Lake, the river that runs through my town, the Truckee River. Up the hill from us is Lake Tahoe. out of Lake Tahoe drains the Truckee River, which comes through Reno. And it goes 120 miles and it ends in a desert terminus lake, which is a fancy way of saying a lake where water comes in and no water comes out, called Pyramid Lake, which is one of the most beautiful desert terminus lakes in the world. It's all Paiute reservation all the way around. It's got the biggest white pelican rookery in North America. It's an amazing place. And it's kind of neat because you have this jewel of Lake Tahoe at one end of our watershed and this jewel of Pyramid Lake at the other. And again, at Tahoe, it's going to cost you $300 to spend the night. Pyramid Lake, I often will drive out there when I'm done teaching a graduate seminar at night. I'll drive out there, walk around in the moonlight, sleep on the ground, get up and go back to town in the morning. So I think of them as sister lakes because they're at opposite ends of our watershed, but couldn't be more different. Tahoe is, I think, one of the most beautiful alpine lakes in the world. Pyramid Lake, one of the most beautiful desert terminus lakes in the world. And we have them both here in our watershed. It's a special place. I hope everybody will get a chance to visit someday. It's just amazing out here.
I think you've convinced us all. I'm looking for any hands because we probably have time for one more question if anybody wants to ask or make a comment. Well, I think I will.
I think Molly has her hand
Oh,
up.
good. Oh, hi, Molly. Go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering, like, as a William and Mary student right now, how your experience at W&M has shaped your writing ability and like what you write about.
Yeah, I thought for sure those were dorm cabinets behind you, Molly. I noticed those earlier, and I thought, okay, somebody is coming from a dorm. It's kind of embarrassing to say, really, because when I was at William and Mary, like a lot of people, I went to William and Mary at age 17, which, by the way, you could drink at age 18 then. So these guys will remember this, but there was only one other person on my freshman hall that first fall, myself and one other guy who were 17. And so there were all these college events, but you had to be 18 to get in. So I was like, ostracized from everything that first year or that first semester. At the time, I was so immature. I was so naive that I really felt like this place is uptight and, my job here is just to push back against everybody and everything. I now have a daughter who's 17, so the chickens have come home to roost. My karma foul has not gone unpunished, if you want to think of it that way. But when I was there, at least in the first few years, I really felt like it was a very constraining environment in many ways. I could not be more appreciative and enthusiastic. As I look back now, for example, I've been a professor for 30 years now. I just look at the people I studied with at William and Mary. I had no clue at the time who these people were and why they were so impressive. I'm just eternally grateful. So I guess I would just say, even looking at you, you look so much smarter than I am, Molly. I just have absolute confidence that you're not going to be as foolish as I was. But I look back and I really wish I could go back and be more appreciative in the moment. Like the people I met, a lot of these guys I'm still friends with, you just go like, oh, okay, these guys live on my freshman hall, whatever. And then you go out into the world and you realize you don't meet people like this everywhere. I've never met people like that again. I mean, special people in a special place at a special time. I ended up becoming a humorist. Jon Stewart lived in our freshman dorm, it's just things that you really take for granted, I think, when you're younger. And I'm a really slow learner, so it took me a long time to come around to this. But the answer is that I attribute everything that I went on to do to my experience there. I was a first generation college student. I would never have gone on to graduate school if I had not had the experience I had at William and Mary. It's weird. These guys could tell you I'd be the least likely poster boy for William and Mary, and now here I am testifying. But I think you're very lucky, Molly. It's a special place, and that's why it meant so much to me to be invited back today, because I've gone back, done a lot of gigs at University of Virginia and at a lot of other places where I've taught and been a visiting professor and stuff. But this is actually my first time back. and I graduated in 1985. So
Long
thank
overdue.
Yeah, so thank you for asking, Molly. And I know we're running out of time, so let me just say how much I really appreciate everybody making time to join us today, and hope again that you'll continue to support the libraries and the programming that they have going on there. The work that Carrie and board members like Tracy are doing is amazing, and they really have earned your support. So thanks to everybody for having me around. My website is michaelbranchwriter.com. It's got a lot of wacky stuff on there that you might be interested in. And hopefully I'll see you all in the flesh one of these years. And meanwhile, everybody stay safe, and we'll see you on the other side.